We're taught slavery in America ended with the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation on June 19, 1865. But what if I told you the institution of slavery in America never actually ended, but was just altered? My name is Darian J. Beckles, and we're here to discuss the Exception Clause. Welcome to the Nightly Civics Podcast. So, what is the Exception Clause? Well, Section 1 of the 13th Amendment, the one that abolishes slavery, reads, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime." It's the except part, or exception part, of that amendment that creates a loophole to not fully end, but continue the institution of slavery under the guise of criminal justice. That's my theory. I can put on my tinfoil hat and speculate the exception clause was a ploy to reboot, rebrand, and or rescue the institution of slavery. Or we can support my theory with numbers. According to a report from sentencingproject.org, 1 in 5 black men born in 2001 are likely to experience prison in their lifetime. 1 in 4, according to Angela Davis's book, Are Prisons Obsolete? And black Americans are in prison at 5 times the rate of whites. The group most affected by mass incarceration and the exception clause is the same group the 13th Amendment supposedly freed. Our guest today will educate us on the exception clause while helping us connect a few dots. We'll be back after a short break to talk the exception clause. Our first brilliant guest to dive into our topic of the day, Tania Tolson. Welcome, Tania.
Thanks for having me, Darian. It's a pleasure to be here today.
The pleasure's all mine, Tania. Give the audience your understanding of In the Exception.
In the Exception is a hashtag that connects people to learn about the racist legacy of slavery that is carried through Jim Crow laws, mass incarceration, police brutality, and how it threatened the lives of blacks and people of color. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery in 1865 in the United States, but however, there is a clause that allows slavery to be used as a punishment for crime and encourages criminalization, incarceration, and re-enslavement of black people.
On your show, you referenced an exhibit you visited in Washington, D.C., I believe at the Smithsonian Museum of African Art. How does that connect to In the Exception?
Aiyana Jackson's From the Deep in the Wake of Drexciya confronts the racialization and sexualization of black bodies. Jackson's bold exhibit is inspired by the legend of Drexciya, a techno duo that consists of James Fitton and Gerald Donald. You know, they imagine an underwater kingdom that was populated by pregnant women who have been thrown overboard or jumped in the ocean during the Middle Passage. Jackson's artwork honors generations of survivors while not shying away from the horror and suffering in the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved Africans.
That sounds powerful. Tell us a little more about this exhibit and how the theme connects to the legacy of racism in America.
The theme of the In the Exception hashtag revolves around advocating for the end of slavery and creating equality. You know, promoting equal rights is for all individuals.
That's an exhibit I'm going to have to see. So, any organizations or think tanks you're familiar with in support of ending the exception?
One organization that I am familiar with is the Mural Arts of Philadelphia. They partner with other museums to display drawings, paintings, and collages by artists who are currently incarcerated. I've never been, but I've planned to visit soon.
You're offering a lot of things for me to add to my to-do list. Thank you. Last question for you. What do you think you can do to end the exception?
Well, the first thing I can do is continue to educate myself and communicate and advocate for change. Next, I can raise awareness by spreading the word about the exception and its impact. Finally, I can support organizations just like the Mural Arts of Philadelphia I mentioned earlier. By getting involved, I can make a meaningful difference and amplify my impact.
Thank you, Miss Tina Tolson, for joining us today. We'll be back in a minute.
We will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
Thank you again, Ms. Tina Tolson, for joining the show. Next up, we have the exceptional and brilliant Jessica Parker on the show. Welcome, Jessica.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Would you kindly give our audience a brief refresher on the exception clause? I know we touched on it in the opener, but I'd like you to offer us a little more depth on the matter.
End the Exception is a national campaign that calls for the end of slavery through the exception clause in the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment exception clause says, neither slave nor voluntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime whereof the parties shall be duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. The Constitution basically says that the only way you are not a slave is if you are not convicted of a crime. But if you are, then you are subjected to being treated less than a human being.
Like my prior guests, you also admire and reference the From the Deep exhibit at the Smithsonian. How does this theme connect with #EndTheException?
From the Deep helps us understand the long history of the African American people in bondage. The exhibit gives us a more in-depth look at the emotional and mental state of African American people during those moments on the boat, knowing that they had to choose between life as a prisoner or death that will guarantee them freedom. From the Deep exhibit speaks directly to the End the Exception podcast because the End the Exception campaign is the modern day transatlantic slave trade.
You mentioned an article in your own podcast about the exception clause. Can you expand on it?
The article, How a 13th Amendment Loophole Created America's Carceral State by Florebes A. Forbes, talks about how inmates are treated in prison due to the exception to the 13th Amendment. The article goes into the pennies on the dollar that inmates are paid for their labor while in prison, as well as what little human rights they have in prison.
Yes, Flores Forbes, former Columbia University administrator and former Black Panther. Any final thoughts on ending the exception?
It is important to know that the United States is still allowing some form of slavery after slavery supposedly was abolished 100 years ago. We need to do something about it while we still can, instead of just sitting around waiting for someone else to do something. We need to stand up for ourselves today.
Thank you, Jessica. We'll be back in a moment.
I remember that we were attempting to capture the globality of the organization of punishment, even as we were very specifically attempting to create a way to understand why it was that such huge numbers of people were in prison in the U.S., the racial disparities of the prison population, and at the same time, the decline of education, of healthcare, and so forth.
Welcome back, welcome back, welcome back. So right now, we have a write-in from a listener, Lance from Washington, D.C., who references a documentary titled What is Democracy?, where he says that the filmmaker Astra Taylor explores the fundamental concept of democracy, questioning its roots, challenges, and the very essence of civic participation. The film prompts us to question whether our criminal justice system truly serves its intended purpose, to the point that we can't help but reflect on how systematic issues like mass incarceration impact the very core of our democracy. Wow, sounds like a powerful film. He continues, also quoting Angela Davis, who we just heard. He says her book, Are Prisons Obsolete? It's something that I referenced earlier, challenges societal assumptions about prisons, prompting us to rethink the purpose of incarceration. Drawing from historical, sociological, and legal perspectives, Davis encourages us to consider alternative approaches to traditional punitive justice. Thank you, Lance from Washington, D.C. We'll take a short break and we'll be back with our final guest.
And you see the white man, he's the boss, he's standing around. But he says we're lazy.
Well, I'm going down the Mobile Road, bring women back by the wagon load. To devil and Lonnie, to man and Lonnie, to God and Lonnie. Well, I don't know, but I believe I will make my home in Jacksonville. To God and Lonnie, to man and Lonnie, to God over yonder.
Last but definitely not least, our final guest, Angela Gray. Hello, Angela. How are you?
Hi, Darian. I'm well. Thank you for having me.
What's your take on the exception clause?
Darian, I agree with the former Black Panther and Arthur Flores Forbes. He was interviewed for the June 2019 CrimeReport.org article, How the 13th Amendment Loophole Created America's Carceral State. He said, I'm not the first to point out the irony that a 154-year-old landmark law that formally ended the institution of slavery in the U.S. perpetuated it by other means. Definitely the exceptions clause intentionally continued slavery here in America.
You mentioned getting involved. What are ways citizens are getting involved to end the exception clause?
Here in America, we get to participate in how things are done. In fact, the Library of Congress has an exhibit called Join In, Voluntary Associations in America. It exhibits a book by Tocqueville and a wide range of local, national, and international associations that have made America. Some of these associations are pivotal in establishing the process of structure of American life to this day. Some of the most known are the Red Cross, Freemasons, NAACP, Salvation Army, American Bar Association, the AFL-CIO, the Abolish Slavery Network, which encompassed the End the Exception campaign, is an association as well seeking to amend the exception.
So what negative impact has the exception clause had on our society, and how do we remedy those effects?
The exception has led to mass incarceration. A crime that feeds on mass incarceration feeds slavery. It's become self-perpetuating. We have to stop the cause that lead people to commit and be convicted of a crime in the first place. Penn Carey Law highlighted the Slate.com article on ending mass incarceration. The piece featured Quattrone Center research fellow Samia Safi, who in April 2003 published an article entitled, "One of the Best Ideas for Ending Mass Incarceration Was Thought Up in a Prison." How ironic is that? The article shares findings on how some of the best ideas for reducing the prison population have come from those in prison. Some examples of the ideas are to provide jobs, housing, education, and simple human equality.
Any final thoughts on hashtag and the exception?
We can end the exception by amending the law, preventing capitalization of mass incarceration, put measures or people's basic needs in place to prevent being subject to the exception itself, and embrace human equality instead of racism.
Thank you very much for joining us, Angela. I'll be back after a short break with my final word.
Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. And before I be a slave.
So, what does the exception clause slavery look like today? Well, not much different from old school slavery. Incarcerated slaves are forced to work dangerous and labor-intensive jobs for pennies on the dollar. According to the ACLU, modern prison jobs only pay an average hourly rate of 13 to 52 cents, which is far below the minimum wage. Incarcerated workers cannot unionize, and they're not guaranteed workplace safety, even working in hazardous conditions. And they're punished for refusing work, with threats of an extended sentence, solitary confinement, or loss of visitation. But hey, at least there are no whips and nooses, right? Seriously, what's the solution? As mentioned by my guest, there are nonprofits and think tanks like ACLU and Vera Institute and social media activists, exhibits that encourage citizens to volunteer and protest, to take civic action against injustice, and to hashtag end the exception. But where are the democratically elected officials? Why do you think they're not fighting to end the exception and ratify amendments that truly banish slavery? Capitalism? Racism? We'll leave that for another episode. Thank you for tuning in. Take care of yourself.